Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us with the British in India. A special welcome to those from different time zones, and particularly to Chris Mason, who is joining us today from the United States to talk about one of the most remarkable men of British India, James Abbott, soldier, Central Asian explorer, district commissioner, and de facto King of Hazara, now a district of northwestern Pakistan. The town of Abbottabad that grew up about Abbott's base camp in the wilderness is named after him. He may also have been the inspiration for Kipling's The Man Who Would Be King and the character of Kurtz in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Chris Mason is Associate Professor of National Security and Director of the Study of Internal Conflict at the U.S. Army War College, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. His background is diverse. 2 years with the Peace Corps in South America, working in rural development, were followed by several as a regular U.S. Navy officer on active duty, followed by a career in the U.S. Foreign Service. He has deployed to Afghanistan and Pakistan numerous times, serving as the political officer on the provincial reconstruction team in Paktika, authoring the first paper in the US government on the Afghan National Army, and working for 5 years on ANA, Afghan National Police, and other security issues as Bureau of Military Affairs representative with the Afghan Interagency Operations Group. He retired from the Foreign Service in 2005 and worked as the South Asian Desk Officer with the Marine Corps, where he wrote the Marine Corps Deployer's Guide to Afghan Culture and the Guide to Operational Pashtunwali. He has trained tens of thousands of deploying US and NATO military personnel on military and cultural aspects of the war in Afghanistan and published widely on Afghanistan and Pakistan over the last 10 years. He holds a bachelor's degree from Carnegie Mellon, is a graduate of the Command and General Staff College course at the Marine Corps University Quantico, and crowned these achievements with a PhD in Imperial History from George Washington University, DC. The topic of his dissertation was General Sir James Abbott, KCB, and we are delighted to welcome him here tonight to talk about his recently published book, Heart Like a Fakir, General Sir James Abbott and the Fall of the East India Company, the first biography of one of the most remarkable men of his day and an immersive account of the last 50 years of company rule in India. The format of tonight's talk is that Chris will talk for 55 minutes or thereabouts. Keep going, Chris, if you wish, followed by question and answer. Please type any questions you have at any point into the chat box, and I shall read them out to Chris at the end of the lecture. Welcome, Chris. The rostrum is yours.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you for that introduction. It's hard to remember where all those years went now. And thank you to everyone in the audience for coming this evening to listen to this book talk. There's so much to go over and so much that I would like to tell you about James Abbott in such a short amount of time that I'm really just going to touch on the organization of the book and sort of what is in each chapter, a bit like a stone skipping over the surface of a lake. The book really had 3 purposes. The first, obviously, was to tell the story of the life of General Sir James Abbott, but it was derived from my PhD dissertation, and of course, it couldn't just be a biography. So the second purpose of the book, which I have gone back and rewritten from the dissertation, was to use his time in India and his voluminous writings. He left behind more than 10,000 pages of journals, diaries, and letters of all sorts, which are now in the India office at the British Library. And I used these as sort of a timeline to explore what was happening in India around him. He really was a very keen observer of the social situation around him. And so I used his writing and those of his contemporaries in the archival record to sort of structure what I was really interested in, which was the breakdown in the relationship between Britons and the people of India between the time of Abbott's arrival in India around 1820, and then, of course, culminating in the horrific events of the Indian Rebellion of 1857, known to generations of Britons simply as the Great Mutiny. But then third was to try to contribute Abbott's perceptions of the causation of the Mutiny Rebellion of 1857 in military terms. Most scholars of the mutiny have tended to focus, and there's such a huge literature on the events of 1857 and 1858. But most of that focuses on the social factors behind the rebellion. And Abbott cast some really interesting light from a military perspective on the breakdown in good order and discipline caused by the rather obscure reforms to the structure, the hierarchy of the East India Company Army itself, effected by Lord Bentinck when he was Governor General of Bengal. More about that shortly. So as you said, James Abbott had a quite diverse career. He was an explorer in the great game, an artilleryman, a poet, an artist, and of course, perhaps the inspiration for Rudyard Kipling's Man Who Would Be King, as well as perhaps Conrad's character of Kurtz in The Heart of Darkness. The parallels between the two men, Abbott's life, particularly in the Hazara district, and Kurtz in Heart of Darkness are remarkable. So the book is not intended to be a hagiography. Abbott was not perfect, but on balance, I think he was a good man. But he was definitely a man steeped in an earlier era. His character really was born in the Georgian era. He was very much a romantic and saw himself as a knight errant, in the classical romantic sense. He survived a number of things which might well have been fatal, including the bite of a rabid dog, which caused 7 puncture wounds, all of which bled and could very well have caused hydrophobia or rabies, as well as a number of other events in his life, which I've chronicled in the book, but really his own worst enemy. And I think that the reason that he has remained in obscurity for such a long time was that he managed to write himself into opprobrium with the British government on a number of occasions. His worst enemy, really, throughout his career was an intemperate pen and the inability to keep his pen case shut when he would have been better served with discretion. Now, he was born, chapter 1, goes into the early years of Abbott's life and talks to a little bit about the crossover between the Levant Company and the British East India Company. Abbott was born into a Nabob family, as the term was then, but an unusual one. His father was born in Turkey, and his grandfather before him and his great-grandfather before him. There were Abbotts in the East from the late 1500s, serving as merchants in the Levant Company. And it wasn't until Abbott's father relocated to Calcutta in 1784 that Abbott's became a part of the British East India Company and began their long association with India. You can see the extent in this great painting of Henry Lanoy Hunter in Aleppo, the extent to which British factors in the Levant Company had assimilated into Ottoman life. And in the early years, of course, in India, I think they did as well, as Dalrymple has brilliantly written in White Moguls. But when James Abbott's father, when he learned that treatment was really not going to be available for Abbott's mother in Calcutta, the family moved back to the UK in 1804, where James was born in Paragon, Blackheath in 1807. And you can see the kind of reception that they got as merchants in the East India Company relocating to England after a career abroad. In this detail of the cartoon from 1783 rather, done by James Gilray, lampooning Sir Thomas Rumbold, a rather notoriously corrupt British official in India at that time. Here you can see the stereotypical depiction of a Nawab atop a sack of rupees riding an elephant, shaded by his Indian servant. And so when Britons returned to London, if they were fortunate enough to return, they were ostracized in London society, and were the subject of many satirical plays and that sort of thing. Abbott's mother gave birth a total of 12 times during their marriage. 2 of the children died in India shortly after childbirth. Henry Jr., his eldest brothers, Clementina and Margaret, were born in India. And in red there in the slide are the children who returned to India as adults. The surviving children, only his eldest brother, Henry Jr., who was an accomplished engraver. You can see in the illustration there, one of his engravings of London. And his sister Margaret did not return to India as adults. Augustus, Frederick, James, and Saunders all became generals in the East India Company Army. His youngest surviving brother, Keith, was the British consul in Tabriz and Odessa before he passed in his 50s. So the family, not untypically, was forced into bankruptcy when one of the people associated with his firm absconded with a significant amount of money, and as a result, the family had to give up their estate in the Paragon in Blackheath and moved to much more modest housing in central London. And the situation turned from bad to worse when his father died on a business trip, and the family really fell into what were sort of considered the genteel poor in London. But James and his brothers were able to avail themselves of the patronage network surrounding East India Company families and attend the military seminary at Addiscombe. You see a couple of photographs there on the right of this slide, taken long after James was there, of course, towards the very end of Addiscombe's existence. And so chapter 1 talks about this patronage network and what occupations were open to the genteel poor and so on. It examines Abbott's early life in the context of East India Company society in the metropole and in England, as well as abroad to some extent. And it also tries to place Abbott into the context of the prevailing social factors at this time in England, including religion, schooling, and education for boys, and so on. And then finally, it examines Addiscombe at this period and the education that young men received if they were intending to be artillery officers or engineering officers. It was not thought that an officer of the infantry required any special schooling in the military profession, and they were sent directly to India, sort of to learn the trade on the spot, as it were. So chapter 2 begins with the description of the 6-month sea voyage to India around the Cape of Good Hope, which was unpleasant and arduous in the extreme, not infrequently ended in tragedy. As much as a fifth of the cadets transiting from London to India died en route from various causes or were simply lost at sea. And they didn't start getting paid until they arrived. So they were sort of on their own pocket for the 6 months of this voyage. This chapter also looked at the experience of Britons arriving in India in the 1820s, obviously long before the internet or even photography could provide any visual sense of what to expect when they arrived, and the culture shock of arrival in India for the first time was noted by any number of contemporary writers. A few Britons were prepared for this kind of cultural immersion so quickly. And it should be pointed out that the trip to India at this time was very clearly understood to be a one-way trip. If you went to India in 1820, there was little or no expectation of coming back to England. Fewer than one Briton in 10 survived their careers in India and were ever able to return back to the metropole. So chapter 2 also examines the lifestyles of officers around James Abbott at this period. There you can see in the middle of this this slide this detail. We will see the full image in a moment, showing the stereotypical British regimental commander when he's met by Tom Raw, the Griffin, in this period cartoon done by Charles Dorley, an Englishman living in Calcutta at the time. Then it ends with James Abbott's baptism of fire at the siege of Bhurtpur, which was the last major battle in India for decades. Lasted about 2 months. Abbott was a mortar commander. He commanded one of the sort of mortars that you see here in the foreground. His elder brother Augustus also served there, as did a rather remarkable character in Afghan studies, a man named James Lewis, who was an enlisted gunner who deserted immediately after the Battle of Bhurtpur and made his way to Afghanistan, where he gained fame under the nom de guerre of Charles Mason, sending back reports on Afghan court events and Afghan history and culture. He was what was considered a news writer at that time. And he would send his reports regularly back to the British in Delhi, who I think knew that he was a deserter, but sort of overlooked the fact. The key point really of chapter 2 is that by 1830, there were several sources of disharmony in the security forces that were beginning to gain prominence, seeds, as it were, of disharmony that would come to a terrible fruition some 30 years later. The first was tension within the East India Company Army itself between the veterans of Bhurtpur, which Abbott participated in and which was derided as a champagne campaign, and the veterans of the First Anglo-Burmese War, who had a much harder row to hoe. They were decimated by disease in the jungles of Burma. The fighting there was confused. And malaria, dysentery, and jungle fevers took a terrible toll of the officers there. And so there was tension between those two camps. About a third of the Bengal army served in Bhurtpur, and about a third served in Burma. And the two really were set at loggerheads after those two conflicts ended. The second tension was really always present, which was that between the Royal Army and the East India Company Army, largely along the class and social lines, as the Royal Army really did not hide their disdain for East India Company Army, who they saw as their social inferiors, and derided them as the mercenaries of a mercantile concern. But finally, the third line of tension that appeared really for the first time in the 1820s was the beginnings of disharmony between the officers of the East India Company itself and their indigenous soldiers, the sepoys and the sowars that made up the bulk of the fighting force of the East India Company. For the first time, there began to be real misunderstanding between the nature of the soldiery of India and the first seeds were sown, as it were, of concerns about their loyalty, concerns about their courage in battle, and so on. And the East India Company began to issue uniforms to sepoys and sowars that were identical to those of the British Army. And so there was sort of a cultural mirroring that began, in which the officers of the East India Company began to think of the sepoys and the sowars as being rather identical to the British soldiers in the Royal Army, with terrible consequences. Chapter 3, entitled Reform and Progress, looks at Abbott's career between 1826 and 1835 within the context of the social reforms, critical social reforms launched by Governor General William Bentinck of Bengal. A lot has been written about his social reforms, and so there, that field has been tilled often enough that I didn't feel the need to get deeply involved there in the book. But it does look at the rather obscure military reforms that Bentinck also employed, which had the effect of stripping regimental commanders of their normal prerogatives, their normal military prerogatives of being able to promote their soldiers, to discipline their soldiers if there was a disciplinary infraction. It basically stripped the regimental commanders of their ability to command their regiments and placed that authority at a higher level in the chain of command, which effectively hollowed out the leadership at the regimental level, with a devastating effect in years to come. And chapter 3 also attempts to take a closer look at the social interaction and cultural assimilation between Britons and Indians in this period. And I push back gently on the narrative that's gaining prominence in subaltern studies now, in imperial and colonial studies, that the British were beginning to distance themselves from the Indian population. I think there certainly was a narrative that was growing of social distance, but the reality seen in James Abbott's diaries and journals, and even often period pictorial presentations, as well as the archival record, shows that the narrative was really just that. It was a narrative, and there was quite a dichotomy between what Britons were beginning to say and what they were actually continuing to do. And I think it reflects a good deal more about how some Britons wished to be perceived at that period than what was actually happening on the ground. And the American idiom for that is talking the talk, but not walking the walk, as it were. So here in this wonderful illustration by Charles Doyley from the book Tom Raw the Griffin, which is just a wonderful period piece, very satirical, but very astute. We see Tom Raw the Griffin, or new lieutenant, meeting his regimental commander. This over here on the far right is the colonel's wife, and here, seen behind a curtain, is their daughter Charlotte, who we're informed is the belle of the ball. She is ardently courted by all of the officers of the regiment. So clearly, there was still extensive cultural intermarriage going on here. And I also found, as I was doing my research, another surprising element in the pictorial record existing in the period portraiture that was done in the 1820s, 1830s, and into the 1840s, depicting Britons living in the East and in India as being fully assimilated into the cultures where they were living. In fact, a majority of portraiture from this period depicts Britons going often to considerable expense to have the only portrait of themselves ever painted. And some of the artists that did these paintings were rather well compensated as being comfortable not only in indigenous dress, but also obviously in indigenous environments. And so if Britons were really actually beginning to define themselves in alterity, one of those neologisms that sort of entered the historical profession lately, one has to wonder why so many of them, a majority of them, were going to great lengths to portray themselves as, in fact, being comfortable and immersed in Indian culture. So chapter 4 then, it's a rather short chapter, but an important one. It's entitled Darcy Todd and the Revenue Survey, and looks at Abbott's involvement in the revenue survey of the Northwestern provinces, which is an almost completely forgotten episode in Indian history, in which the British government, through the East India Company, set about mapping the entirety of the Northwestern provinces, plot by plot, every farmer's plot, 20 yards by 20 yards was mapped out by surveyors. Obviously, the purpose of this was to make tax revenue collection more efficient, but the means by which it was done reflected a considerable and earnestly contested debate about the nature of land ownership in India and who should own the land. And a number of Britons, including Robert Byrd, who led the survey, felt that the land should belong to the men who farmed it and not to absentee landlords living in some faraway city. Not coincidentally, it was these very provinces, the Northwestern provinces, where the rebellion, the mutiny of 1857 took place. So chapter 5 then begins with the start of the First Anglo-Afghan War, Great Britain's first ill-advised attempt at regime change in Kabul. It's entitled A Mission to Khiva, 1838 to 1843, and Abbott was recalled to the town of Karnal, where the Army of the Indus was being assembled. Abbott met up there again with some old friends, including Henry Lawrence, who he had attended Addiscombe with, as well as Darcy Todd, who had been at Addiscombe as well, and his brother Augustus, to go to war in Afghanistan. To pass the time, while the army was made ready to march, Abbott and Henry Lawrence decided to start a literary journal to be edited by Lawrence's wife, Honoria. More about her later. The journal did not ever get off the ground, but it did cement Abbott and Lawrence's friendship, which was to have momentous consequences in James Abbott's life, as well as did his reunion with Darcy Todd, because after the Army of the Indus marched through Balochistan and up through the Bolan Pass on the border now today between Pakistan and Afghanistan, they were able to invest Kandahar with relatively little relatively little resistance. And then once they reached Kandahar, Darcy Todd, who had been an artillery trainer with the Persian army prior to his arrival in Karnal, was tasked with undertaking a political mission to the Emir of Herat. Herat being at that time a separate emirate, and it was thought by the British that good relations with the Heratis on the left flank of the Army of the Indus moving towards Kabul would be to the benefit in securing their left flank. And so Darcy Todd was ordered to go to Herat. He selected James Abbott as his Secretary of Legation. There were 2 British surgeons in the contingent, as well as a platoon of sappers who were to repair some of the damage to the citadel of Herat. And so they made their way up here to the city of Herat, which they found in a terrible state of repair, having been under siege by the Persian army. They met there the redoubtable figure of Eldred Pottinger, a British lieutenant who had taken it upon himself to organize the defenses of the citadel of Herat successfully. The Persian army was forced to decamp and return back home. But the city itself was in a terrible state. as a result of the siege, and the British delegation was to offer its friendship to the emir and do what they could to ameliorate the suffering of the people following the siege. But then an extraordinary thing happened. An emissary of the Khan of Khiva, the emirate or the Khanate of Khiva in Central Asia, arrived in Herat at the same time, reporting that the Khanate was about to be invaded by a Russian army led by General Vasily Perovsky in order to free 500 Russian slaves who had been seized on various caravans and business in the Khanate and enslaved within the Khanate. And the ambassador from the Khan asked for whatever help they could get. And so Darcy Todd decided, sort of on his own, to dispatch James Abbott as the lone Briton, together with a small number of Afghan traveling companions, to go to the city of Khiva and try to stop the Russian invasion by whatever means sort of occurred to him on the moment. An extraordinary thing, particularly so because no Briton at this time actually knew where the city of Khiva was. It was, in fact, somewhere up in this blank area of the map. In Central Asia, no Briton had ever been there. And so James Abbott was ordered, well, go find this city, meet the Khan, make friends, and stop the Russian invasion, which could seem, a rather quixotic quest. But in that day, in that era, the officers were quite willing to undertake this sort of thing, understanding at the outset the chances of survival were rather low. And so James Abbott set out in the dead of winter on Christmas Eve to find the Central Asian city of Khiva. He did, in fact, find it. And upon reaching Khiva in 1839, he successfully negotiated the release of the 500 Russians held in slavery in Khiva, and the Khan began to assemble them, a quite lengthy process to get them all together from the corners of his kingdom, to assemble them in the city of Khiva. But at this point, news reached the city of Khiva that the Russians were making progress towards the city and perhaps were close to investing the Khanate with military force. And so James Abbott decided not to wait until all of the slaves had been assembled, and he set out with his party to meet the Russian army and sort of try to head off the invasion. And so they went from point number 3 on the map here to point number 4, Mangishlak Bay on the shores of the Caspian, to try to find some Russian ships that they thought might be there that could take them to the Russian forces at the time. They did not find any Russians there, and so they set out. They backtracked a little bit and began to make their way north towards the Russian forces when calamity befell. Abbott and his party were enslaved on the shores of the Caspian by a party of Kazakh slavers. In the melee, in their campsite in the dark, in the sword fight, Abbott lost his hand was maimed, and he lost 2 fingers on his right hand. And they were enslaved in a yurt, much like the one here in the lower right, for 3 weeks out in the Central Asian steppe with no blankets, awaiting to hear, what their fate was to be. A couple of the party were sold off into slavery, and then an even more extraordinary thing happened in the form of this man, Saleh Muhammad, the son of the chief judge of Herat. Abbott met him in Merv and was quite struck by him, and wrote a letter to Darcy Todd in Herat asking Todd to hire Saleh Muhammad and put him on the British payroll as a British agent, which he did. And then Saleh Muhammad tracked Abbott's party down across the steppe to Khiva and then up to Mangishlak and then to the slavers' camp and negotiated the freedom of Abbott's entire party. An extraordinary thing, really. And Abbott and Saleh Muhammad remained friends until the end of their days. They were often together. They reunited for a number of events in Abbott's life. And Saleh Muhammad went on to be a remarkable British agent throughout the Great Game. He was sent with Charles Connolly, or with Arthur Connolly rather, to Bokhara to try to release Colonel Stoddard. They were imprisoned with Colonel Stoddard, and when the Khan of Bokhara offered to release Saleh Muhammad because he was a Muslim, Saleh Muhammad refused and remained with Connolly and Stoddard until both men were executed by the Emir of Bokhara. He was also present in Kabul during the famous retreat of the British Army attempting to reach Jalalabad through the Khyber Pass. Unfortunately, there's not a great deal in the British record about Saleh Muhammad. I spent a great deal of time trying to find him. In British records, there are a few bits and pieces here and there, but he was a remarkable character. And if Abbott's story, his exploration of Central Asia, has a hero, it is certainly Saleh Muhammad and his extraordinary efforts to release the party. So then James Abbott and his traveling companion, Samud Khan, who you see here next to Abbott, in the famous portrait that was painted of him in London upon his return. They made their way up to St. Petersburg, where they met the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Count Nesselrode, as well as he was greeted by Tsar Nicholas at a military review. And then he was ordered back over here to London, where he met briefly with Lord Palmerston, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Charles Hobhouse, who was at that time the president of the East India Company, and the senior East India Company official in London. And then they made their way back through France, down through Italy, over to Greece. And then it was at that time practicable to go across the Sinai Peninsula by camel caravan. And they made their way through the Red Sea. And then the two men finally parted, and Abbott made his way back to Calcutta. But the story of Samud Khan and Abbott's travels in London forms part of this chapter. It's the extent of knowledge of Britons of Afghanistan and Afghans at this time was negligible. Most Britons that they met did not know what an Afghan was, which was kind of striking considering that Britain was at that time occupying Afghanistan. But so then upon his return to India, Abbott was appointed the resident or the assistant to the resident at Indore with responsibility for the district of Nimar. And now a captain promoted for his exploits in Central Asia. He was able to think of marrying, and he met and married the woman of his dreams, who he loved deeply, Margaret Ferguson, in Calcutta on February 15th, 1844. And the couple made their way by sea around the bottom of India up to Surat, and then by land from Surat over to Nimar. This is how it looked at the time. The Nimar district's a very picturesque area. It's dominated by the Asargar Plateau and fort. This is how at the top is how it appeared in Abbott's day, and very much the same it appears today. And here in the lower left of the photo is the building that I believe was probably the British commissioner's residence, his bungalow, although I'm sure it was built after Abbott's time there. Now, Abbott, as I mentioned, was a prolific artist, and he wrote several volumes of poetry, which he published during his lifetime. Not very good. In fact, quite lugubrious poetry. He strived all his life to be a great poet and never achieved it. But some of his very best pen and ink work, he was a better artist than he was a poet. And some of his very best work was done here in Nimar. He was his own man. In a picturesque district with his new bride, and his artwork reflects that. What I had to do, because it doesn't fit into the chronological flow of the book, I took all of Abbott the artist out and put it into an appendix, talking about his sensibilities as an artist and the sensibilities of the time, and his fascination with Sir Walter Scott and so on, and his various literary influences. And made that put that at the back of the book because it didn't really fit within the chronological flow. But then tragedy struck His daughter, Margaret Ann Abbott, was born almost on their first anniversary, February 10th, 1845. But his wife, Margaret, died of complications of childbirth the next day on February 11th, 1845. The first grave that Abbott erected for her, you see with that the numeral 1. That's my numeral 1, not his, in the British cemetery at Asargar. And he later had that replaced with this tall spire that you see in a drawing, his second drawing of the cemetery, shown at figure 2, which looks very much like his gravesite today in the UK. Interestingly, the monument on the right is the last resting place of Captain Grierson Maitland, who died there in 1820. And that tomb, that headstone is still there today. At least it was some years ago. The epitaph is now quite weather-worn and faded, but largely legible. But I could find no trace of Margaret's grave. It's just simply not there. Abbott was then recalled to Calcutta following the death of his wife. He traveled with his infant daughter and his wife's aunt back to Calcutta, where he became the commissioner for the sea embankments, 1,000 miles of seawall built by the British to make parts of the area behind Hijeli arable and to enable the harvesting of salt. But this was interrupted by the outbreak of the First Anglo-Sikh War, when the Sikh army, the Khalsa, moved south into British protected territory. The first major engagement of that war was the Battle of Firoza Shah in December 1845, and this set off essentially a mad dash by the officers around Calcutta in Bengal, all the way across the subcontinent up to the Punjab to try to take part in the fighting. East Indian Company officers and Victorian officers in general went to great lengths to get involved in fighting. This was really the sine qua non of a military career. Most travel was done by what was called dak, which was a carriage like this, somewhat like a stagecoach in the American West, as well as by camel and by horse. And so Abbott set off to the Punjab to try to, join the Bengal artillery up there. The final battle of the First Anglo-Sikh War was the Battle of Sabruan, which took place on the 10th and 11th of February, the 9th and 10th of February, rather, of 1846. And the war ended. On February 18th was the surrender of the Sikh army, and Abbott arrived near Sabruan 3 days later. But he was now in the Punjab, where the most interesting chapter of his career was launched. He was reunited here now with Henry Lawrence, who was appointed resident at Lahore. And the first thing that Lawrence needed was a good surveyor to survey the new boundaries created by the Treaty of Lahore, which ended the First Anglo-Sikh War. And so he knew that because Lawrence had been a surveyor in the survey of the revenue survey of the Northwestern provinces in a district adjoining being surveyed by Abbott, Lawrence knew that Abbott was a good surveyor. He knew of Abbott's service in Central Asia and thought that he was just the right man to go out and erect these new boundary markers, which he did. And when he completed that, he joined a circle of officers now tasked with administering the newly assimilated the districts of the Punjab as a result of the surrender of the Sikh Empire after the First Anglo-Sikh War. A group of young men that were called, fittingly, Henry Lawrence's young men, a quite typical organization for the Victorian period. There were Kitchener's Cubs and any other number of similar sorts of circles, which were not unconsciously modeled on King Arthur's court and the Round Table. And many of the officers that became part of Henry Lawrence's young men were to become household names in years to come. John Nicholson, William Hodson of Hodson's Horse, Harry Joe Lumsden, who founded the Corps of Guides, George Lawrence, who was Henry Lawrence's brother. There were 3 Lawrences in the Punjab, as well as James Abbott, And here in the upper left, you see an illustration by an unknown Sikh artist of Henry Lawrence together with the Rana. All right, so this was basically Hazara district as it appeared at that time. It was described at that time as being, quote, somewhat larger than Wales in extent, which would be somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 square miles. It's considerably smaller today, as parts of Hazara district have been hived off, cut away, and made part of other official districts within modern day Pakistan. So today it's about half the size that it was when Abbott was there. And now in chapter 7 begins, I think, the most fascinating chapter of James Abbott's life, entitled "The Man Who Was King." His stay in the Hazara district from 1849 to 1853. And this was an assignment right at the heart of Abbott's conception of himself as a knight errant in the romantic writings of the day by Sir Walter Scott and Thomas More, who wrote Lalla Rookh, of course, and many others. He was on this wild tract of land inhabited by the wild Hazara mountaineers. This is a period illustration of a Hazara mountaineer. There were cavalry and clad in black mail, wearing the old Persian kulakud helmets, and officials rode about in howdahs on the back of elephants and so on. It was the very heart of Abbott's soul and self-image. And he became the district commissioner there, and was in the district when the second Anglo-Sikh War broke out, an effort by the Sikh nation to expel the British from the Punjab. And Abbott was the only British officer who was able to remain at his post at the head of a small army of irregulars who tried to harass and trip up, raid the Sikh army forces of Chattar Singh when they could. This would be called today guerrilla warfare, and Abbott was almost certainly the very first British officer to be a leader in guerrilla warfare, partisan warfare. And so the chapter here really goes into some detail about Abbott's life in the Hazara. He was referred to in official British correspondence as the King of Hazara, and they weren't happy about it. But a number of sources referred to him as the king, and he did, in fact, as the saying was at that time, go completely native. It was fascinating. His adaptation to Hazara culture, and this is one of the descriptions, the period descriptions of Abbott in the journals of Honoria Lawrence, an extraordinary English woman, the first English woman to live in Nepal. She was really a pioneering figure in British India, doing a number of things that it wasn't thought that British women would be able to do at this time. A very intrepid woman and a brilliant observer of the world around her. She never thought that her journals would be published, and in fact, they weren't for many decades afterwards. But in her journals, she described James Abbott saying, "I suppose it is many years since shears or a razor approached him. His beard and hair are silver white, a broad-brimmed white hat, coat and trousers made after the taste of a Hazara tailor, in other words, a shalwar kameez, a spiked staff about 7 feet long, and the whole man alive with energy, and a remarkably sweet and gentle voice." So in a sense, for those of you familiar with the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, it sounds a little bit like his description of the literary figure of Gandalf in a way. He dressed very much like a Muslim fakir, as you see here in this period illustration of a Muslim fakir. I don't think that his selection of the color white was coincidental. I think Abbott chose the color white very consciously, and is dressed very consciously to resemble that of a Muslim fakir in this part of the world. And now there are a number of period reports from indigenous sources, indigenous people, talking with British officers who record their affection for James Abbott in circumstances which make it clear that this is not part of the British narrative of the beloved district officer. Clearly, Abbott stands apart from his peers in this sense of becoming essentially the King of Hazara. Colonel Sir Robert Warburton, who was the son of a Pashtun mother and a British officer, obviously fluent in Pashto, recorded in his book that he was at one point walking in the Khyber Pass behind two very old men, and he heard the name Abbott over and over again in the conversation between these men, and he excused himself, but spoke to the two elders who turned out to be from the Hazara district, and it turned out they had both been men who had served with James Abbott during the Second Anglo-Sikh War, and this is where the title for the book comes from. The older of the two Hazaras then offered to Robert Warburton his feelings about James Abbott, saying, Abbott Sahib's heart was like a fakir's. He was always thinking of and for his people. There were many accounts like this, and these indigenous accounts really, I think, help validate the British accounts because so many of them recorded so many decades apart and so many thousands of miles apart really are remarkably consistent in the wording that they use. Colonel Frederick Burnaby in his book, A Ride to Khiva in 1876, more than 30 years, almost 30 years after Abbott was there, spoke with a mullah in Merv who knew Abbott, remembered Abbott from 30 years before, and described him in very similar terms, saying he was such a nice gentleman. He was a medicine man and cured several sick people in Merv while he was there. And so Abbott had become, sort of a figure in Merv as well, despite his rather short stay there. And then Sir Olaf Carreau, in his book, this is a wonderful book, The Pathans. He traveled in the Hazara district while he was in official charge of the district for a few months in 1927. And in the village of Kabul, Carreau encountered an elderly man, Qasim Khan, who had just celebrated his 100th birthday. But his memory was still razor sharp. He remembered the epic flood on the Indus. Although it had been 75 years since James Abbott had left the Hazara, Qasim Khan remembered Abbott. And when Carreau asked him about Abbott, Qasim Khan's eyes lit up and described him just the same way the elderly mullah in Merv had done. Said he was a little man with bushy hair on his face and kind eyes, and we loved him. I was at the Jirga when he asked us if we would stand and fight the Sikhs if he stood by us. We swore we would, and there were tears in our eyes, and a tear in Abbott Sahib's eye too, and we did. He was our father, and we were his children. There are no Angres like Abbott Sahib now. There are a number of accounts like this of James Abbott, indigenous accounts, and I've recorded several others in the book as well. A little known aspect of Abbott's time in the Hazara is his involvement with the cult that came to be known as Nicholsonites. Most of you are probably familiar with the Nicholsoni cult. It's thought to have centered entirely, typically on Nicholson, a rather troubling figure in frontier history. But in fact, it was a ditheistic cult, as Lieutenant George Pierce wrote in the Hazara district in 1854. When the Nicholsoni Fakir chiefs saw and knew James Abbott, they were at once as much impressed by his singularly pure, good, noble, and generous nature as they before had been by the hard, violent, and brave one of Nicholson. And soon James Abbott was raised to the godhood. He became the Lord of Generosity. And then the Fakirs, who were quite scholarly men, went about the Punjab singing the praises of Nicholson and Abbott, telling people through Sanskrit verses that the avatars of a new and pure revelation had come. So they were really sort of the yin and yang of this cult of Nicholsonites. Abbott was kind and generous, where Nicholson was harsh and brutal man. One of his peers once said he had a face over which no smile ever passed. Abbott's last assignment was the Black Mountain expedition, his last military campaign in 1852 and 1853 against a group of Islamic fundamentalists who the British called Hindustani fanatics. You see a latter-day photograph of them in the upper right. And this is sort of a curious case of history coming full circle. The Hindustani fanatics were the ideological forerunners of today's Taliban. They share the same Deobandi inspirations and interpretations of Islam. Abbott and his party were able to drive off Hindustani fanatics, but not roll them up completely. And they continued to plague the British in India for another 50 years. But ironically, perhaps, it was the Taliban, the descendants of the Hindustani fanatics who sheltered Osama bin Laden. And Osama bin Laden, of course, was found and killed by U.S. Navy SEALs about a decade ago in the town that was named after James Abbott after he left the Hazara district shortly after his last campaign against the Hindustani fanatics. After leaving the Hazara district, he was assigned to be the political officer at the Saugor and Narbuda district. But he requested instead assignment to the gunpowder works at Ishapur, south of Calcutta, which may very well have saved his life again because the Saugor and Narbuda district was swept up early into the Great Mutiny, and many of the civilians there were killed early in the uprising. So Abbott was there south of Calcutta throughout the Indian Rebellion of 1857, had an interesting involvement in preventing the insurrection from starting in the city of Calcutta at Fort William. And that's described in this chapter as well. Technically, Abbott might have been entitled to the issue of the Mutiny Medal because he, towards the very end of the mutiny, he marched a troop of artillery up through the area around Delhi, where there were still mopping up operations going on. And under the expanded criteria of the award of the Mutiny Medal, this might have entitled him to it, but there are no Abbotts on the medal roll. So none of the Abbott family participated in the suppression of the mutiny. Of course, everyone knows about the extent of the Great Mutiny and the terrible things that happened in the rebellion of 1857. Here in this map, you can see where the mutiny was confined to. It was clearly limited to the Gangetic Plain, the area in red here on this map. For all intents and purposes, the Madras and Bombay presidencies were not affected by the rebellion. But this is precisely the part of India that was mapped by James Abbott, Henry Lawrence, and others during the revenue survey of the northwestern provinces 2 decades earlier. So that ends chapter 7. Chapter 8 really looks at the end of Abbott's life and nearly the end of this lecture. Of course, the Great Mutiny of 1857 brought about the immediate end of British East India Company rule in India. Crown rule was announced with the enactment of the Government of India Act in 1858. But the EI company continued its existence. It had made an agreement with its investors to pay out when the East India Company's economic activity in India was ended officially in 1833. Its investors were guaranteed 40 years of annuity, and so in 1873, the East India Company was formally dissolved on 1 June 1874. But this also, more than just marking the end of the East India Company, marked the end of the old India. The rebellion of 1857 and the terrible animosities that it engendered put a hard stop to any meaningful cultural interaction between Britons and the peoples of India for the remaining 90 years of colonial control of the subcontinent. Intermarriage, which had been the norm prior to the Great Mutiny, dropped to almost nil, with some exceptions, particularly among enlisted men in the Royal Army, who continued to intermarry with the peoples of India, and also in Burma, where concubinage and intercultural marriage continued until the beginning of the 20th century. And the military personnel and civilian administrators of the British East India Company were then absorbed into the Royal Army and the Colonial Office, respectively. I think the very last vestige of the East India Company is the East India Club, today located at 16 St. James Square, I believe, with some 300 members or so. So James Abbott retired to England in October 1867. It had taken him 30 years to get promoted from lieutenant to major, because it was done strictly on the basis of seniority, and literally someone senior to you had to die for you to move up, in the nominal role toward promotion. But then just another 11 years to make it from major to major general. On the left, you see Abbott as a major in this hand-tinted photograph taken in Delhi, I believe, after the rebellion. And then on the right, Abbott at retirement as a major general. You see he's still using the white gloves there to cover the maiming of his right hand in the sword fight on the Caspian. And then Abbott married again. He married his goddaughter, the child of a family that he had known in India, the de Montmorency family. They married in October 1868 when Abbott was 61 and Maud de Montmorency was 30. And then unthinkable tragedy struck again. Just 18 months after the couple was married, Maud died in childbirth while giving birth to their son, Raymond. These are the last two photographs ever taken of James Abbott. He was knighted a commander of the Order of the Bath finally on May 26, 1894. And the reason that was delayed so long, I've gone into in the book in some detail. It was basically the result of a contretemps with Benjamin Disraeli, who was his schoolmate in childhood back in London. And the final photograph ever taken of James Abbott, and on the right, and the only photograph, I believe, showing the injury to his right hand. You can see he's missing the first and middle fingers here of his right hand in this photograph taken perhaps a year or so before his death. So James Abbott died on the Isle of Wight on October 6, 1896, and is buried in Guildford Cemetery, Surrey, England, with his second wife, Maud, and his son, Raymond. His epitaph fittingly reads, Plenus vitae conviva. Sadly, the spire, as you can see, the grave here, the grave site is very similar to the one that he used to mark the grave of his first wife, Margaret. The spire is broken off at the top there, and it's one of my goals to find some way to repair that grave to its original form. That's on my bucket list of things to do. So with that, I'll stop here. There's a great deal more I would like to say, but I'll call this discussion and questions. I'm not sure I have any answers, but I'm certainly willing to field whatever inquiries there may be. This is a painting, perhaps James Abbott's best, entitled Rock of Aornos, a watercolor he did in 1858. And I've often thought that these figures here in the foreground perhaps represent James Abbott in red, and perhaps his wife, his late wife Margaret, and his daughter Margaret Ann there in green, facing him on the other side of the shallows there. So anyway, Valerie, I'll stop there. So much more to say, but we better get to the discussion and see what folks are interested in.
Chris, thank you very much for your fascinating and really wonderful talk, amazing PowerPoint. It's not surprising there was plenty of interest from publishers in your book. Thank you for insisting on a proper print run, enabling it to be published at a price we can afford, rather than accepting the print-on-demand edition offered by so many publishers that prices books out of the range of any but a few university libraries. And thank you also for presenting your material in a style that is accessible to the general reader as well as the specialist, and insisting on the inclusion of over 100 images, many featured in your PowerPoint, depicting people and places. The result is not only the study of a man, but of his times and time and place, or places, I should say, and of the extraordinary world of British India, which you depict with great empathy, if not uncritically. Now, we've got a few questions here, so I'll start with the first one, which is, thank you very much, Chris, for your excellent presentation on James Abbott. Being a native of Abbottabad, I read your book with great interest and am very much amazed by the intricate details of Abbott's life in addition to his time in Hazara. Although his personal involvement with the town now named after him, he still remains revered as a patron. This is evident that Abbottabad is the only place in the subcontinent that retains its English name. In my quest to know the man, I did stumble on another painting of James Abbott and possibly Samad Khan by the Caspian Sea, possibly made by the same painter in London. I have also met the man and seen the artifacts whom James Raymond left his father's artifacts to. It is located in Norfolk, but is in dire need of restoration. Happy to share pictures. My question is, what led to the mistrust between James Abbott and Chatter Singh, and who was Colonel Kanara, who, in spite of being in the employment of the Sikhs, defied their orders, which kicked off the confrontation?
I'm fascinated by all that you've talked about there. I would very much like to get in touch and learn what you know and see the images that you found. So if you could give your contact information to Valerie, I would very much like to get in touch and continue this discussion. Starting by email, I was fortunate to be able to speak with Mr. Omar Tarin while I was doing the research for the book. And so I'm aware of some of Abbott's ongoing reputation in the district. I think Abbott, British sources, the archival record shows clearly, in fact, Abbott was singled out after the Second Anglo-Sikh War as having been the only political officer who realized what was going on, who realized that there was a plot led by Chatter Singh to drive the Britons out of the Punjab. Abbott kept many spies. He ran his own private intelligence network throughout the Hazara district, and he had a number of sources of intelligence of what Chatter Singh's intentions were. And after the massacre at Multan of Patrick Van Agnew and another British officer, it was clear that there was a broader plot afoot. And the Sikhs admitted this. After the Second Anglo-Sikh War, it became clear that this had been a plan that had been hatched a couple years before, with the full knowledge and support of the Maharani, the Princess Jindaur. And so Abbott alone among the political saw through this and tried to warn his superiors, who were really not in any mood to hear it. Political officers tend, if they're responsible for the Pacific nature of their districts, tend to see things that way. And there's a lot of what is called confirmation bias, by which people select the things they want to hear and do not believe or listen to the things they don't want to hear. And so Abbott was reporting to his superiors that Chatter Singh was in fact planning to mutiny with his regiment, the Chukerji regiment, and join the mutineers at Multan, and that this was part of a broader plan to retake what was theirs, to regain control of the Sikh nation, the Sikh kingdom, the land which had been theirs for time immemorial, and drive the British invaders out of their land, which certainly by any means they were entitled to do. Abbott, but this was one of the first cases where Abbott really got himself in trouble with his own pen, with his intemperate writing about the intentions of Chetar Singh. And I think the British were ready to relieve him in place because he just wasn't towing the line of the official British line that all is well, things are fine, there's nothing to see here. The war broke out before Abbott could be relieved for reporting his suspicions of the impending war. But after the war ended, the British record of the war is very clear in saying that alone among our politicals, only James Abbott realized what was going on and tried to tell us what was about to happen. Conrad was, by all accounts, an American mercenary. There were any number of European mercenaries fighting in the Sikh army. Most of the Sikh artillery was instructed by Europeans, Britons, French, Germans. It was really sort of a multinational effort. Conrad apparently had partly Viennese ancestry as well. Abbott says that his real name was Kennedy, but that he took the nom de guerre of Colonel Conrad. And it was Abbott that had the memorial built to Conrad after Conrad refused orders to move his artillery in support of Chetar Singh without getting orders from Abbott to do so. Chetar Singh had him murdered, paid a bounty for his head, and it was Abbott that erected the memorial to Conrad. Abbott, styling himself as a British gentleman, thought that Conrad was rather coarse and not very gentlemanly, but noted that he was loyal and respected the man for standing his ground and refusing to obey orders without British authority from the resident at Lahore or his representatives in Hazara district, James Abbott. But by all means, I would love to continue this discussion, and I hope you will give Valerie your contact information. Perhaps we can have a Zoom call like this one to talk about what you found and add to the record. I did this book really to try to get this story of James Abbott out to the public and to anyone who might be interested in it. I think it's really cracking good history. And just a fascinating story. And for reasons which we could go into at another time, he really was written out of the official history of the Punjab because he went native, and he didn't really fit into the narrative of the very British district officer behaving, like a proper Sahib. And instead, became the King of Hazara, which just didn't fit with the British history of the region at all. And so they went to great lengths to sort of, cut that down to size and sort of, stick it in a footnote. And so Abbott was left out of the history for many years. But I in working with my publisher, I said, okay, if you will publish a trade paperback version of this that's accessible to people and won't just wind up on some dusty library shelf at a university, I'll forego all royalties on this so that we can get this story out to the people. So I love the fact that you bought the book, but rest assured, I did not make any money out of that deal. I'm just glad that you read it.
Well, our questioner has sent his contact details, and as part of this saving of recording process, they also saved the chat. So I shall pass his details on to you, and you can have your session on Zoom. You've actually also, I think, probably answered one of our other questions, which is, why is this the first biography of Abbott? Other so-called paladins of the Punjab, Nicholson, Hodson, Harry Lamsden, Edwards, all had biographers.
They did. I think Abbott really fell between two tectonic plates. For years, the history of India was dominated by the British, who had a narrative to tell. The British narrative was of this empire of opinion, the paternal district officer, the benefits of British rule in the Punjab and the Northwest frontier, as it were. They had a stereotype of this district officer, and Abbott did not fit that stereotype at all. The archival record makes it clear that Abbott was considered eccentric in the extreme. Henry Lawrence said he has a peculiar power of attracting Asiatics to his personality. So he was not at all. He did not at all fit this mold. And then, of course, after independence, the pendulum of history swung back over to the Indian side of the house, and the Indian narrative about what had gone on, which was obviously quite different from the British narrative, and could be broadly classified in the historicity of India as the subaltern movement and the post-colonial studies movement, which sought to tell the story of India from the viewpoint of the Indian people, and it was quite a different story. But Abbott didn't fit within that narrative either. Someone who actually was beloved by the people, who the historical record, the number of indigenous accounts from this period make it clear that Abbott was indeed very loved by the people. I've included in the book any number of indigenous accounts that I was able to unearth. For example, pieces of paper with Abbott's writing on it were used as talismans of good luck in the Hazara district well into the 20th century, and perhaps even up until the second half of the 20th century. And so Abbott, actually becoming the King of Hazara, didn't really fit into the subaltern view of things either. And so he was sort of like, I think, pushed aside, pushed out of the picture by both narratives, and kind of fell through the cracks there, because he really, got himself into hot water with British authorities on any number of occasions by writing letters that were quite rude and intemperate. They always say, sleep on a letter before you mail it. Abbott would dash off some correspondence and put it, in the mailbag of the next writer, on his way, and thought better of it often the next day. But the wheels of bureaucracy ground exceedingly fine in the East India Company, and Abbott was reprimanded on several occasions for being rather disrespectful of British authorities. And so the fact that he wasn't didn't follow the proper bureaucratic writing style of Calcutta, landed him in hot water, and on many occasions I think it sort of relegated him to a small part of Sir John Kay's official history of India, which discusses the Paladins on the Punjab and so on. I think that's probably what happened. I wondered about that myself. I should say that there was an effort made by an English scholar to put the Abbott's life together in the 1950s. An English woman named Evelyn Werga Thomas did some wonderful work in the British Library organizing Abbott's papers, and I really feel like I owe a debt as a scholar to Miss Werga Thomas, who I think would have published a biography of James Abbott had she lived to do so.
Now we have another question here, which is, do you know how and when the town of Abbottabad was named after him? He is still held in high regard in Pakistan, I spent 6.5 years there and 6 weeks in Abbottabad, says our questioner.
The name for the district center, Abbottabad, was suggested by Herbert Edwards, another of the paladins of the Punjab, another of Henry Lawrence's young men. He was briefly sent to Abbottabad after Abbott was recalled. After Henry Lawrence left the Punjab, Henry Lawrence was really Abbott's protector. Lord Dalhousie did not like Abbott at all. He was one of the British officials who referred to him as the King of Hazara. But Henry Lawrence was able to shield Abbott from official opprobrium, mostly because Abbott was keeping the peace in a district that had always been rather troublesome to the Sikhs. But once Lawrence was transferred, then that was it for Abbott, and Abbott was quickly sent elsewhere. But when Abbott left, Abbottabad was there were no structures there. I understand that Abbott may have built a log cabin near a stream outside of what today is Abbottabad, but that's long since gone. And when Abbott left, it was basically just a large open area without much in the way of permanent settlement. There may have been a couple of tents there. And it really wasn't until well after James Abbott left that campsite, which had a population of a few hundreds, well after James Abbott left, and didn't become a major population center for many decades afterwards. It was Edwards' suggestion that the town be named, or the campsite basically be named Abbottabad. James Abbott never saw it by that name, and there is a poem that is quite popular about Abbottabad that was circulated again after Osama bin Laden was killed, and appears, I believe, in the historical center in the town of Abbottabad. It is said to have been written by James Abbott, but it certainly was not. James Abbott was a romantic poet. He published many volumes of poetry, as I said, all of it quite bad. But in the Spenserian stanzas, he spent hours and hours perfecting his rhymes, and published these epic poems that ran to 30,000 words about everything that he could think of. But he never wrote that sort of doggerel. All of his poetry and his attempts at novels and so on are all found today in the India office, in the British Library archives. But that poem is nowhere in the 10,000 pages that he left behind. And believe me, I went through them all, page by page, translating his chicken scratch. And if that poem had been written by Abbott, I certainly would have found it. Clearly, someone besides James Abbott wrote that bit of doggerel, and certainly used words like fuss that James Abbott would never have used, and appeared nowhere in his writing. But so I think really that it was well after James Abbott left before a place of any importance bore his name. I do believe, however, there is another town in what is today Pakistan that is also named for a British officer. The name doesn't come immediately to mind, but I believe there are two towns today still in what was once British India that are still named after a British officer.
I think the town you may be referring to is Jacobabad.
That's it, Jacobabad, yes.
Named after John Jacob, who was a contemporary of Abbott's, but he wasn't one of the paladins of the Punjab. And well, I don't know enough about him, but I do know that he was revered for his administration, which, I mean, he was in his province or his town, for his centre or district for quite some years, and he put in place, I gather, a lot of irrigation reforms and others that were enormously beneficial. Now someone says, this is the gentleman from Pakistan again, that poem, in my opinion, was much below James Abbott's penmanship, and it mentions Abbottabad, which never existed in his time in Hazara. So this is the bad poem that you're referring to that's in Abbottabad. But we do have another question. It's a question actually about the mutiny, and it is, I notice you use the term mutiny rather than uprising, as is often used now. Can you please comment why you used mutiny?
Certainly. I guess I use both. I try to use both terms within the book. I guess I'm a little bit old school. The uprising was known to generations of Britons simply as the Great Mutiny. Every historical coin has two sides. The British saw what happened in the Bengal presidency as a mutiny of their enlisted soldiery, and in British terms, that was mutiny. By this point, the British had completely lost touch with what the contractual nature of the sepoys and the sowars was, which had been established in Mughal times. And the sepoys and the sowars were quite right in standing their ground. And when the events of 1857 were by no means the only mutiny to occur in South Asia during the first half of the 19th century. There were many such mutinies. The mutiny at Vellore was just one that happens to be well known, but in my research, I uncovered several others, which the British were sort of at pains to cover up and pretend didn't happen. They didn't want this idea of mutiny getting out among the populace, and so they suppressed news about the numerous mutinies which occurred on a smaller scale throughout the first half of the 1800s, including one in which James Abbott himself tried to get engaged at Bhurtpur, in which many sepoys were slaughtered in the suppression of that mutiny. Whereas the British saw this purely myopically as mutiny, whereas the sepoys and the sowars quite rightly saw it as a labor dispute. The profession of arms was an honorable profession in India and had been since time out of mind for millennia. Being of a fighting caste in India was a very honorable thing to be, and being a soldier was just a way to make a living. Quite like many other occupations. And when the British failed to uphold their part of the labor contract, the sepoys and sowars conducted what was their version of a labor stoppage until the wrongs had been redressed. So there was clearly a cultural disconnect occurring that led up to the events of 1857, 1858, which, as you correctly note, is now called the Rebellion of 1857. I think there's considerable debate still in the scholarship of British India about just exactly what those events constituted. I don't think there's much archival support for the contention that it was, for example, the first war of national independence. I think a number of scholars from India have brightly pointed out that there was really no sense of national identity at this time, that identity in the subcontinent personal identity was at some subnational level. There really wasn't a sense of India as a nation at this point. And so I've tried to use both in the book. I've tried to sort of use the terms to either together with a slash between them, because I'm trying to represent both sides, both viewpoints in this. I've tried to represent the British view as well as the indigenous view, and be respectful of both points of view. I think rebellion is probably a good term, although I think there's really considerable historical debate to be had, and my book is really not, the purpose or the place to go into it, but there's considerable debate about the extent to which there was rebellion that occurred outside of a few political elites and the Bengal Army and parts of the Bengal Army. It should be noted that not all of the Bengal Army rebelled or mutinied. About 30% of the regiments of the regular Bengal Army remained loyal to the British, predominantly those which were comprised of Sikhs, Muslims, Gurkhas, and other ethnicities, not predominantly, not mostly of Hindu origin. So yeah, it's a great question, and I've tried to be even-handed about it in the book, and I've tried to use both terms. But I think both points of view, deserve to be considered in the historical record.
Well, I'm going to be asking the wrap-up question here, which probably raising some issues that I think probably lots of other people are interested in too. And it is, I noticed a few parallels in bio notes of you with your subject, James Abbott. You both worked as political officers in the same part of the world. You made a study of Afghan culture and Pashtunwali, and Abbott immersed himself in local culture. And you both had similar service backgrounds. You were a gunnery officer in the US Navy. Abbott went out to India to join the Bengal artillery. Where did you discover Abbott, and were these parallels the source of your interest in him?
Well, I had never thought about that before, and I don't think my own, professional record can hold that candle to James Abbott. I did serve in Afghanistan. I think there's a picture of me here. I don't know if this is still. There it is. Yeah, there's a picture of me hanging out with Hamid Karzai during my time in Afghanistan. That's as close to the great man as I ever got. I actually learned of James Abbott after I began my PhD studies at George Washington University, where I read for the first time a book called Soldier Sahibs by a British journalist named Charles Allen. Which is rather, has a rather one-sided view of events, but I thought was well written, and I was sort of taken by Abbott and wanted to learn more, and so I started to delve into this and found my dissertation advisor was rather skeptical. He's a great British colonial imperial studies scholar, Dane Kennedy. At the George Washington University, now retired. He was rather skeptical that there would really be enough here for a dissertation. And what I stumbled upon in the British Library is what every historian dreams of, a huge treasure trove of documents which no one has looked at for the last 100 years. When you get something out of the archives at the British Library, you see the access records to that file. And in the majority of cases, some of the files had been looked at by Ms. Werga Thomas in the 1950s, but most of the files had not been looked at in a century. And so this is what every historian dreams of finding, a pile of archival records that no one's seen. And I was able to convince Dane Kennedy that perhaps there was a story here that was worth telling. Because I thought that Abbott's observations really sort of began to push back a little bit against, more recent history of the British in India in this period, in the 40 years running up to the events of 1857 and 1858. And what Abbott's keen observations of the society around him did not sound like what I was reading in subaltern studies and post-colonial studies literature. And I thought, well, maybe there's a story here. Maybe we need to examine this period in history with more nuance and less generalizations. I think it's possible that both things were happening at the same time. that this period in history leading up to the rebellion of 1857 was in fact contested even as it was happening, that many Britons saw what was happening around them and reacted to it. Some adopted the new narrative of separation, some did not. James Abbott, for example, maintained remarkably close relationships with the people of the subcontinent throughout his life. Saleh Muhammad came to join him in Hazara during the Second Anglo-Sikh War, and the men were together again during that period of conflict, and came to see him many times in Delhi afterwards. And Abbott maintained contact with Samud Khan, his companion in Central Asia. And so, Abbott was a person who cared deeply about the people of India and maintained close personal relationships. And he was not alone. And so I think there needs to be more nuance in the discussion, the historical discussion of this period, and somewhat less generalization. And I hope Heart Like a Fakir, is a step in that direction.
Chris, you'll be reading some of the compliments our attendees have paid to you when I sent you a copy of the chat. But one attendee puts it perfectly. Fascinating story, nicely told. And I think that it's quite obvious with the care and love that you've put together this Zoom video and your enthusiasm for the tale you tell in it, that you've written really a rather wonderful book. And I do hope very much that your presentation tonight, and particularly your book, which is affordable and so very well worth reading, really spur younger scholars on to investigate some of the received wisdoms of the enormous corpus of writing on British India that you challenge in your book, and you've challenged also in your presentation. There really is quite a lot of that challenging of received wisdoms and myths about British India in your book. And it may well be because you're an American scholar and you're looking from outside and you're seeing things more clearly than those who work in a grand tradition or react against it. So someone else is saying very many thanks indeed. It's one of your questioners. I will seek out the book. Well, you could seek it out on the publisher's website where there's a 30% discount, which brings it down to under £30. Otherwise, Amazon, Blackwell's, I'm pretty sure it's in Blackwell's, are always good sources of for books and discounts. So Chris, thank you so very much for your wonderful talk, your wonderful Zoom presentation tonight, and your generosity in sharing the amazing story of James Abbott, which deserves to be much better known with our audience tonight. And thank you again. And thank you everyone for coming along. And don't forget that our next talk is a month from now. I've gone and lost the date, of course, but it's by a very distinguished lineup indeed. Dr. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones, Rana Chinna, and Andrew Ward, who is the author of the most magisterial work on the massacres of Cawnpore, who's going to be speaking on that particular episode of the mutiny. And that's a month from now. I think it's about the 21st of next month. And we'll be starting that at 6 o'clock because Rana Chinna is joining us from New Delhi. So after putting that plug in, I'll return to Chris and thank him very much again, and thank everyone who came along.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you
Good
for
night,
everyone.
Chris. Good night, everyone.